Good morning, my ECO 3311 students. This is the final chapter, chapter 16 of this recording for this class. And make sure you watch this last video. I've already uploaded at Canvas the review sheet for the final exam this Friday. I've also uploaded at Canvas a bunch of practice questions and answers. So make sure you study and study and study and bring up your A game on Friday so that we can end up wrapping up this course. I'm going to have additional office hours tomorrow, which is Thursday. I'll be in office from 2 to 4:30 p.m. Then I'm also going to be in office on Monday, on a Friday morning. I would say from 8:45 to about 10:30 in the morning, right before our test at 11 o'clock. So anyway, let me share my screen on chapter 16. I did finish chapters, all the video recording for the rest of the other chapters that are going to be on the exam at Canvas. So make sure you're watching those videos before you embark on even completing the last sets of assignments, which are already at Canvas. Okay. So let me share my screen and we'll talk about it on the other side. Okay, so here's the last chapter. So chapter 15, we use this geometry to try to understand how the tools of monetary policy work, how the Federal Reserve controls the supply of dollars in the economy or control the federal funds rate, interest rates. Here we're going to continue and talk about the conduct of monetary policy, strategy, and tactics. Okay. I know some of you maybe maybe you serve in the military. In the military, when they're talking about when the military goes to war, they're talking about an overarching strategy. The overall strategy is to win the war. But the little things that they do on the battlefield, day in and day out, is what we call the tactics. How they're gonna, sometimes they may round up the enemy, the enemy forces, or they use some tricks to make them be successful on the battlefield. The same, you think about the Federal Reserve too. The Fed has got these overarching goals of monetary policy that it wants to achieve. So we're going to talk about the little things that the Fed does on a day-to-day basis to make it successful for realizing its overall overarching strategy of achieving the goals of monetary policy. So to preview the chapter and talk about the learning objectives, this chapter is going to examine the goals of monetary policy and then considers one of the most important strategies for the conduct of monetary policy, which is inflation targeting. So we'll talk about inflation targeting. And then we'll talk about some, what they call the Taylor rule. Okay, so the learning objectives here, we're going to define and recognize the importance of what we call a nominal anchor. Okay, I'm going to define that. A nominal anchor is going to be some economic variable like a money supply that ties the price level to achieve the price stability goal. We're also going to identify the 6 potential goals of monetary policy that monetary policy makers like the Federal Reserve may pursue. Out of those 6 goals, there are going to be 2 most important ones. In fact, the first one is the most important one, which is price stability, controlling inflation. Then the second most important one is, of course, maximum employment, making sure that the economy is as close as much as it can be to its full potential value, producing at full potential or full employment. And so we shall also summarize the distinctions between hierarchical and dual mandates of the Federal Reserve System. Hierarchical is basically the idea that the Federal Reserve is going to have like different goals that they want to achieve, maybe 6 of them. And then the Fed is going to place them according to their degree of importance, like put them in hierarchy. Okay? It's kind of like somebody having a shopping list. If you have $200, okay, you want to take your girlfriend out for dinner, or you want to go for shopping, you want to go eat, this kind of stuff. You have a shopping list. The most important, $200 is not going to get through all those activities, but you prioritize your what? What's the most important thing you must do first with the $200? That's what the Fed is going to do. The Fed might want to achieve 6 goals, but they're going to say, well, what are the immediate things that we need really to achieve? And then we shall compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of inflation targeting, which is this new monetary policy framework that started from New Zealand in the 1990, and it's spread to an increasing number of central banks in Europe and emerging markets like Brazil, South Africa, Israel. They're all inflation targeters. But the United States so far has not adopted inflation targeting. We're going to talk about that. The United States pursues policy through what we call discretionary policy. Inflationary targeting, you need to follow some kind of rules. It's a rule-based monetary policy. And then we're also going to identify the key changes made over time to the Federal Reserve monetary policy strategy. So when you go back in time and look at how the Fed has always been trying to pursue monetary policy, you go back in the 1970s, the Fed used to target some aggregate like some money supply directly. Then they switched to targeting the value of the US dollar. And then in 1993, up to today, they have been targeting the interest rate, which you call the federal funds rate. They set a target on the federal funds rate. You saw a little bit in chapter 15 when I talked about how the Fed is going to control the federal funds rate when they set a target on it. And then, we're also going to list the 4 lessons learned from the global financial crisis of 2007-2009. There were some hard lessons that economists learned that we took for granted, okay? And we shall discuss what they mean to inflation targeting, and we shall summarize the arguments for and against a central bank policy response to asset price bubbles. Okay, we talked about what a bubble is. And then describe and assess the 4 criteria for choosing a policy instrument. So a policy instrument is going to be different from a tool of monetary policy, okay? So the instrument is kind of like a tactic, what the Fed is going to do to achieve to make sure the tools reach their broader goals. And then we're going to interpret and assess the performance of the Taylor rule as a hypothetical policy instrument for setting the federal funds rate. So John Taylor, who is an economics professor at Stanford University, developed a framework that he thinks that we can use, me and you or the market can use to predict what the Federal Reserve may do to policy, to interest rates. Remember, the Federal Reserve always said, the Fed meets about 8 times in a year. Every meeting, they have to decide whether or not they want to increase or decrease interest rates. And the market is always on edge because interest rates affect our investments, okay? But we don't really know as Americans and as Wall Street or the market doesn't know what the Fed is going to do to the interest rate in their next meeting, when that might come in a month, whatever it is. So I call it John Taylor, but John Taylor helped put a mathematical formula that you can use, you and me and the market can use to predict what the Fed might do to interest rate, whether they're going to increase, decrease, or let the federal funds rate stay the same. So we'll talk about what the Taylor rule is all about, and then assess its performance, compared with what the actual interest rate turned out to be. Okay, so let's talk about the nominal anchor here, kickstart off things here. So the price. So one of we listed 6 potential goals of monetary policy that any central bank wants to achieve. But out of those, whether you go to the Central Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the US Federal Reserve System, the Banco de Mexico, the Bundesbank, or the Riksbank of Sweden, the Reserve Bank of Australia, every central bank over the last couple of decades have made price stability to be what they call the overriding goal of monetary policy. What do I mean by this? So while the Federal Reserve or any other central bank may have numerous goals that they want to achieve, the most important goal that any central bank wants to achieve is price stability, because most central banks around the world have increasingly become aware of the economic and social costs of inflation. So if inflation is something that is an economic evil that can impose a lot of costs on society, then the central bank must do something about it. That's why price stability is going to be the overarching goal of monetary policy. Not just for the Fed, but for any central bank. So the nominal anchor is a nominal variable such as the inflation rate or the money supply, which ties down the price level to achieve the price stability goal. What do I mean by this? So if the Federal Reserve wants to keep prices of goods in the economy stable and inflation anchored at some level, like a 2% range that it always wants it to be, the Fed they may come up with a level of money supply growth that is consistent with that level of inflation that they want in the economy. The Fed might say, well, for us to achieve the 2% inflation target, we shouldn't be printing money anyhow. We can allow the money supply grow at a rate of about 2%, which is consistent with the growth in the general growth of the economy, how the economy is growing. That would be consistent maybe with keeping inflation anchored at its 2% range. Okay, so then the 2% money growth becomes a nominal anchor because that's going to tie the price level to achieve the price stability goal. And then I'm going to talk about some famous concept called the what they call the time inconsistency problem in discretionary policy. Maybe I should start with that. Okay, time inconsistency problem. So typically, there are two primary types of policy, which I did not put on the slide, but I want to talk about it here. Two types of policy that the Fed, any central bank, or any policymaker can what? Pursue. Two types of policy. Policy can be what we call active policy. It's where the policymaker intervenes, maybe I say actively intervenes to make corrections on policy based on trends in economic activity. So, for example, if GDP is falling, economy going to a recession, the central bank is going to jump straight and say, okay, let's lower interest rate. That's they're actively involved because they're following trend. But the second policy, what we call passive policy. Passive policy is basically where it's more like a laissez-faire type of policy, where the policy maker does not actively get involved consistently on policy making, on policy changes. When economic circumstances change, they kind of take a back seat, let the economy kind of self-correct itself, more like a laissez-faire type of mentality. Okay, but out of this, there's also going to be two types. So given that policy can be passive or it can be active, we can also say there are two ways to implement policy, whether monetary or any type of economic policy. Two ways of implementing policy. One, policy can be implemented through what we call rules, what we call rule-based policy. So here, the policymaker, like a central bank, like the Federal Reserve, follows certain rules to achieve its policy mandates. For example, a central bank may come up with a rule that no matter what, we're going to allow the money supply grow at a rate of 2% every year. So that becomes a rule-based monetary policy. Or we are going to have inflation be anchored at 2%. We're going to target inflation in the medium or in short or medium term. So no matter what happens, as long as inflation is at least 2%, that's what matters. That's a rule-based model. It's very strict. That means if the central bank, people running the central bank deviates from that rule, they could get, if they deviate from that rule, they could get fired. They can lose their job because they are not following the rule. The second is what we call discretionary policy. Discretionary policy, well, the policymaker does not follow any specific rule, does not follow any rule, but will change policy from time to time, depending on what they see best for the economy. In fact, the policy of the Federal Reserve, as we're going to be talking about, is implemented through discretion. The politicians, even though the Congress wrote the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which created the Federal Reserve in the first place, Congress does not meddle on the affairs of the Federal Reserve. Let the Fed is going to pursue its monetary policy by discretion, what the Fed thinks is best for the economy. And they would change policy from time to time, okay, when economic circumstances change. So there are two economists who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And one of the things that they wrote about, which the awards committee, when they won the Nobel laureate in economics, cited, it was based on this paper. So these economists, they wrote a very powerful paper in 1977. Actually, there are two papers that were cited by the awards committee when these two economists won the Nobel Prize. One was a 1977 paper, which I'm going to talk about briefly. And the other one was a 1980 paper, which it was basically building the real business cycle theory. Okay, but this one was just one of those brilliant work that they did. So this economist it's Finn Kidland and Edward Prescott. It's a 1977 paper. The title of the paper was "The Time Inconsistency of Optimal Plans." Okay, so the argument this economist made in this paper is that if you allow, the main idea is that if you allow a policymaker too much discretion, then that is going to bring, they will often renege on previously announced policy. This can damage the policymaker's credibility. I'm going to give you examples here. Policymakers' credibility. Okay, when I say renege, basically means they will change policy, they change their position from what they told us before. So one example I'm going to give you here, which is always very common in the United States. Okay. Congress, example what a time inconsistency problem look like. So example include that. Let's give you a few examples. Example, Congress may say They will cut taxes. But faced with a higher budgetary deficit, they may raise taxes instead. That becomes a time inconsistency problem. There are so many of them. I'm going to give you another example. I have a friend who used to work for USAID, which is now being shut down anyway. So he told me that the policy of the US government to develop poor countries where the US gives food aid and other forms of foreign aid is that if a developing country needs foreign US foreign aid, like food aid, they need to demonstrate to the US government that they are not corrupt, they are following some kind of rule of law, okay, good governance, and some of the good things that we want in like in free society. But a developing country, in the end, is not good. So the government is going to put that as a condition for receiving this aid. That if you don't show us that you're democratizing your economy, you're going to or to moving towards open society, following the rule of law, we're not going to give you the aid. But my friend told me that even though that is shown on paper, that U.S. government will not disperse aid to this country, which is supposed to be practicing these good things, but they choose not to. So a developing country is going to choose not to follow whatever the United States government tells them to do on paper. But aid is still given anyway, because the U.S. government might fear starving poor kids in developing countries. Okay, because there could be a lot of starving kids, maybe because of famine somewhere in some countries. We need to get food aid in there, you know. So that's a timing consistency problem. The other examples that I could think about, timing consistent problem also like affect us. Like it's not only in policy, but you think about your own behavior. You could say if you okay. Here's a deal. Let me give you guys an example. So I have a friend who sets like a very strict at the very beginning of the year. He comes up with New Year's resolution. Okay, so you could say that, oh, I'm gonna work out and develop muscles. I'm gonna lose 20 pounds. I want build big muscles. And then he starts working out the very first 2 months of the year. He start dieting well, no sweet, no sugar in his diet, and avoid all these things. But as the year passes by, all the month passes by, he starts to dip his hands again in this delicious rocky ice cream. And the weight starts to pile up anyway. So my friend is faced with a time inconsistency problem because he's doing that at his own discretion. But if somebody sets a rule for my friend to follow, like a dietary rule, saying that, okay, this is what you're going to be eating from January 1 to December 31. We eat this, we do this at this time. This is a time you exercise, following some rules. Maybe the weight will not pile up again. So that's a time inconsistency problem, that my friend, because he's doing it at his own discretion. Another example, I'm a parent. Parents, sometimes we set very strict rules for our kids to follow. That if a kid does not follow certain rules, we may punish them, or maybe take away their toys, give them timeouts. But I'll tell you what, sometimes you go with your kid. Let's say you go with an unruly kid to a party, a kid who is not behaving, and then the kid starts throwing tantrums at a party. Okay, and then the parents are they start to look a little embarrassed. So instead of punishing the kid because they want the kid to shut up, maybe the kid is crying so much, they may decide to reward the kid with candy to keep them shut up for a moment. So that's a time inconsistency problem, because you already said you're setting the behavioral rules for your children at your own discretion, but faced with some conditions, you move away from your position to actually reward bad behavior. Okay, so that's discretionary policy. So we talked about that. The problems that the Federal Reserve might be faced with when we allow policy to be set by discretion. Okay. Okay. So let's kickstart thinking. Let's talk about the goals, other goals of monetary policy. Because we said, okay, actually, I would put number 0 here because I already mentioned that the most important goal of monetary policy that comes first, we said is what? Price stability. I talked about that already. Then these are other goals that the central bank, like a Federal Reserve, might want to achieve. They want high employment and output stability, economic growth, stability of financial markets, interest rate stability, stability in foreign exchange markets. So stability in foreign exchange market, we want the value of the US dollar to be stable. So if the dollar is not very stable, let's say we wake up tomorrow and the dollar depreciates, 40% of its value is gone, the central bank, the Fed, is going to act using its international currency reserves to bring the value of the dollar back in check. We're going to be interest rate stability, stability of financial markets. Okay, the Fed regulates financial markets in the financial institutions, makes sure that the banks are not screwing up. Economic growth, they promote economic growth, making sure the economy is growing. But be careful, these 6 goals of policy, sometimes they can be conflicting. In other words, while the Fed may want price stability, if they overdo it, that could actually they may end up actually making this not possible, the second one. So some of the goals of monetary policy might be conflicting. There's a trade-off. Okay, if you want price stability, let's say the economy was faced with inflation and the Fed wants to stabilize price by disinflating, by reducing inflation, the Fed would be increasing interest rates. You know that. That's one way of bringing inflation down. You increase interest rates. But if the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, that might not be good for investment. So when investment get affected, that employment could be affected. So the Fed may not be able to achieve its goal of high employment or output stability if it chooses to focus too much attention on price stability. So that's a kind of like inconsistency in some of the policy goals. So if you're Federal Reserve, you need to walk a very blurred line between price stability and, for example, maximum employment that you want to achieve. Okay. So should price stability be primary goal of monetary policy? Of course, yes. Okay, and then there are 2 types of of mandates. This is what we call hierarchical mandates. Hierarchical mandates basically means you put the goal of price stability first because that's the most important goal of any policymaker, monetary policymaker, like the Federal Reserve, and then others follow. As long as price stability comes first, the other goals can follow. Dual mandates, when the Federal Reserve Act was written and passed into law by Congress in 1913, Congress made sure that the Federal Reserve was observing 2 main goals, like keeping prices stable in the economy, that means controlling inflation, and output stability, maintaining maximum employment. That's what they call it. So it became a dual mandate. In fact, every year, the chair of the Federal Reserve testifies before Congress. And those are the 2 things that Congress always brings up when the Fed chair is testifying on Capitol Hill. They want to find out whether the chair of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve in general is keeping up with those 2 dual mandates of maintaining price stability and output stability. Okay, that's how they're going to grill them mostly along those lines. So as long as the price stability as the primary long-term goal of monetary policy, either type of mandate is accepted as long as it operates to make price stability primary goal in the long run, but not the short run. That's right. Okay, so now let's talk about inflation targeting. So inflation targeting is one of the hybrid new policy that many central banks around the world started implementing. It started in 1990 from New Zealand. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand was the one that started implementing what? Inflation targeting. What is inflation targeting? Inflation targeting involves a public announcement of medium-term numerical target for inflation. So the central bank, through their spokesperson or the chair or the leader of the central bank, has to come publicly, maybe on some national TV, and announce to the citizens of the country that they're going to keep inflation at some numerical in the medium term to maybe at 2%, 3%. They set a target on inflation so that everybody knows what the goal is. Okay, but because they have committed to that numerical target, that means if they don't achieve that goal, they could be fired because it's a rule-based monetary policy. So the inflation targeting also involves institutional commitment to price stability. The central bank must commit to price stability as the primary goal, long-term goal of monetary policy, and a commitment to achieve the inflation goal. So it also involves what they call information inclusive approach, in which many variables are used in decision-making processes. And then because the inflation targeting, the spokesperson for the central bank comes and announces what the bank is going to do, some economists believe that that actually leads to increased transparency compared to what we see with the Fed. We don't know what the Fed does behind closed doors until when the Fed announces policy on interest rates, which happen every other month and a half. So some people have argued here in the United States, because the Fed doesn't implement inflation targeting. They implement policy at their own discretion. So some people are arguing that, oh, maybe the policy of the Fed, there's less transparency. The Fed is less accountable, because they keep things in the dark until when they have made decisions on policy, on interest rates. Okay, so inflation targeting can increase transparency and make the central bank more accountability. So here's a little history of this framework, monetary policy framework called inflation targeting. As I said, it started in New Zealand. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand started implementing in 1990. There was some evidence, though, because inflation New Zealand was quite high. That's one of the reasons why the central bank, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, adopted inflation target in 1992, and to make inflation their primary goal of monetary policy. So there's some evidence that inflation was brought down because of inflation targeting within the target, okay, most of the time. And growth has generally remained high in New Zealand. Unemployment has come down significantly. The Bank of Canada, which is the Central Bank of Canada, followed suit and adopted the inflation target in 1991. Inflation decreased in Canada too in 1991. So some cost in terms of high unemployment because of what I talked about. There's a trade-off always. If you're putting too much emphasis on controlling inflation, that means you'll be raising interest rate. That might mean higher unemployment or low output. And then the United Kingdom started implementing inflation targeting in 1992. Inflation has been close to its target. Growth has been strong in the UK when they started in 90, and unemployment came down. So here's the reality of those counts. But maybe for England, the Bank of England, if you look at this, maybe you could argue that for England, we don't see a lot of evidence that inflation targeting was responsible for bringing inflation down. Why? Because inflation was already coming down in the UK anyway. It was high. But then when inflation targeting was, inflation was coming down already. Maybe you could argue that the case for Canada, maybe, see, they adopted inflation targeting when inflation in Canada was really high. It's close to like 7%, 8%. And then after the adoption of inflation targeting, inflation came down rapidly in Canada. Okay. Same thing in New Zealand. Inflation was a little bit high, elevated here, but after adopting inflation targeting, it came down. So it's kind of like, but the proponents of inflation targeting are always arguing that inflation targeting helps the central bank to bring inflation down. The counter argument to that is that what about countries that did not implement more inflation targeting, like the US? The United States never adopted inflation targeting, and we also saw inflation in America coming down rapidly in the 1990s. So it's kind of hard to argue that inflation targeting is a sole framework that can help bring inflation down. Because we have seen evidence in America that even though we did not adopt inflation targeting, inflation also came down rapidly in the US in the 90s. But anyway, here are some of the advantages of this framework. Advantages mean of inflation targeting, it reduces the potential for falling in time inconsistency trap. Because I talk about time inconsistency trap when you set the policy through your own discretion, by your own discretion. Because inflation targeting is a rule-based monetary policy. Okay, so it's gonna, the central bank is gonna avoid falling into that time inconsistency trap every time trying to renege on a policy. Okay, and then it's easily understood because communication between the central bank and the public. So the public gets to understand quickly what their central bank is doing. And then also it stresses transparency and accountability. It's consistent with democratic principles, improve performance. The disadvantages of inflation targeting is what we call, there's going to be some kind of delayed signaling. What do I mean by this? Many policies affect the real economic variables or real economic activity with a lag. So let's say a central bank, which was faced with high inflation, let's say inflation was 10%, and then they adopted inflation target and announced to the public that the goal was to reduce inflation up to 2% in the next 2-3 years, or in the next year. But we know that changes in policy can only affect the macroeconomy with a lag. It takes time for policy to have a real effect on the economy. Because of this delayed signaling from policy, from policy change to the actual impact of policy on economic activity, that could be disastrous for people who are leading the central bank. So people are going to question what their performance is. In terms, they promise low inflation, but inflation, they're not seeing low inflation within the medium term or short term. And the other thing is, yes, it's very rigid because the inflation targeting seems to place too much weight on price stability. And some people argue that the central bank may lose traction from the other broad goals of monetary policy that might also be warranted, like goals like output stability, goals like financial market stability, interest rate stability, stability in the foreign exchange market. They're also good. Those are good goals too, But if you're focusing too much attention on inflation targeting, that means it's too rigid for you to be flexible to also make sure that the other goals of monetary policies are achieved. And there's a potential for increased output fluctuations, especially during times when the central bank is trying to disinflate. You get more output is going to fluctuate and low economic growth during that period of disinflation. Okay, now let's talk about the evolution of the U.S. monetary policy going back to 1970s. So the United States, first of all, has achieved excellent. First of all, the U.S. monetary policy strategy is not inflation targeting. I really want to take that. In fact, we're going to say the U.S. Federal Reserve monetary policy is by what? Discretion. The Fed never pursued discretionary policy. Sometimes we just call it the Fed's just do it approach. That's the one way of saying the Fed is implementing what? Discretionary policy. We say the Fed just do it approach. Meaning that nobody sets the rules for the Fed to follow. The Fed just going to implement policy by its own discretion. But we know the United States has achieved excellent macroeconomic performance, including low and stable inflation, until the onset of the global financial crisis of 2007. They did that without using any explicit nominal anchor, such as the inflation target. The U.S. Federal Reserve uses what we call implicit, though. They use what we call implicit, not explicit. I'm going to explain what that means. Implicit nominal. So we believe that the Federal Reserve has got some internal numbers that they're working with, even though they don't explicitly announce to the public, but within the central bank, within the Federal Reserve, we believe that the Fed implicitly set a target on inflation of about 2%. They want inflation anchored at 2%, but they just simply don't make it a spectacle by announcing it to the public. So it has got an implicit nominal anchor, not explicit like the New Zealand people are doing, or people in England, the Bank of England and others. So here's a little history of the Federal Reserve monetary policy strategy. So the Fed began to announce publicly targets for money supply growth, not inflation, in 1975, where they would say, okay, would allow the money supply to grow at 2-3%. That was a time when Milton Friedman was very popular, when the theory of monetarism became very popular in the United States because of Milton Friedman. Because Milton Friedman argued how monetary policy was so powerful in causing business cycles. Okay? So the Fed started targeting the money supply. So Paul Volcker became the chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Then Paul Volcker changed the strategy of U.S. monetary policy from targeting the money supply to targeting non-borrowed reserves, which I talk about non-borrowed reserves in chapter 15. You know what that is. And then again, from when Greenspan, Alan Greenspan is the longest serving chair of the Federal Reserve. He became chair of the Federal Reserve. He served for like 19 years. Longest serving chair of the Fed. So in July 1993, when Alan Greenspan was chair of the Fed, he announced that the Fed would not use any monetary aggregates such as non-borrow reserves or money supply. The Fed would start targeting interest rates. So from 1993 to today, the Fed sets a target on the Fed on interest rate, on this interest rate called the federal funds rate, which I talked about in chapter 15 as well. Okay. So that's kind of so there's no explicit nominal anchor for the Fed. The Fed does not come and announce to the public, to American public, that their goal is to maintain inflation at 2-3%. But they have like what we call a forward-looking behavior and periodic preemptive strikes. What do we mean by that? Preemptive strikes the idea that the Federal Reserve, when the Fed notices that inflation might be coming up in the country in the next 2 years, there are signs that inflation might be propping up. The Federal Reserve is going to, because forward-looking behavior also means the Fed's going to use forecasts. They're going to forecast inflation for the next 2 years. If they see that inflation might be elevated in the next 2 years, what that their forecasts tell them, then they're going to use preemptive strike. Preemptive strike means the Fed will start pursuing policies, like say strict monetary policy, like contractionary policy, before inflation gets started. Okay, you put it off before the fire starts burning, right? That's what we call preemptive strike. The goal is to prevent inflation from getting started. The advantages of Federal Reserve monetary policy are that it uses many sources of information and it has demonstrated success. The disadvantage is that people who don't like the Fed, they're going to say there's lack of accountability. We don't know what the Fed is doing, and they believe that this might be inconsistent with our democratic principles. So the advantage of the Feds, when I talk about the Feds, just do it approach. Well, that's what they call discretion. In other words, we're saying discretion, we just say the Feds just do it approach. So the Fed is use forward-looking behavior and stress on price stability also help to discourage overly expansionary monetary policy, thereby ameliorating the time inconsistency problem. Disadvantage of the Fed just doing up with lack of transparency. That's people talk about that. So I already said something about that. No repetition here. So when you look at inside the Federal Reserve advocacy for inflation time, when Ben Bernanke was a professor of economics at Princeton University, Ben Bernanke wrote a lot on inflation targeting, like basically in support. All his writings before he became the chair of the Fed was, so many people thought that when Ben Bernanke became chair of the Federal Reserve, he was going to steer the U.S. monetary policy towards inflation targeting. But guess what? When Bernanke became the chair of the Fed, even when he became governor, he continued to advocate for adoption of inflation targeting. He was a chair of economics department at Princeton University, and then he was appointed to the Federal Reserve Board. He served as one of the governors of the Federal Reserve System from 2002 to 2005, Board of Governors. And then in 2006, George W. Bush appointed Ben Bernanke as to lead the Fed, the chair of the Fed. Okay. So Ben Bernanke served for 8 years. Okay, from 2006 to 2014. Okay. All right. What about the European Central Bank, the ECB? What are their strategy? The European Central Bank has also been slow to move towards inflation targeting, but they adopted some hybrid monetary policy that includes some elements of inflation targeting, but not full inflation targeting. Remember the ECB, as I said in chapter 13, they formed the ECB and tried to mimic what the Federal Reserve looks like as much as they could possibly do that. Okay, now let's talk about the lessons that we learn as economists from the global financial crisis of 2007. This happened 2007 to 2009. There were some hard lessons that economists learned that we thought were not going to happen, right? One lesson that we learned was that economists have always thought that financial frictions, if you have any problem in the financial market, it would not impact the broader economy, like the real economy, like it would not affect GDP, inflation, stuff like that. But we learned the hard way that the development in the financial sector can actually have a far greater implication or impact on economic activity than we hardly realize. We learned the hard way because remember the financial crisis in 2006, 2007, 2009 started from the meltdown, the housing meltdown. Okay, the housing market fell, banks started failing, and that led to the Great American Recession. Something that we never thought would happen, that such frictions in the financial market would trigger these large movements in real economic activity. And then the other thing that we learned the hard way, that the zero lower bound on interest rates can be a serious problem. We saw that. Okay, so when the financial crisis hit in 2007, that led to the Great American Recession, very deep recession. The interest rates in the United States were already close to zero. Remember, for the Fed to implement monetary policy successfully, the Fed needs some room. You need interest rate to be at least some a relatively high level, because the Fed is always going to try to lower interest rate to keep the economy strong during a recession. But the question was, if interest rates are already close to zero and you're hit with a terrible recession, how low can the Fed go by lowering interest rate? Would you lower interest rate and make them negative? Because you don't want, because what is negative interest rate leads to what we call liquidity trap. We don't want to do that. This negative interest rates lead to what we economists call liquidity trap. Liquidity trap is the idea, if interest rates become negative, this notion that let's say you put $10,000 in your savings account and banks are paying you negative interest rate. That means at the end of the year, your money is going to be worth less than $10,000. You think anybody's going to save money? No. What about banks? If you go to the bank and borrow some money, that means you're going to pay back less than you borrowed, because because interest rates are negative. This happened in Japan, actually. In the 90s, the economy of Japan was weak, and the Japanese central bank, the Bank of Japan, lowered interest rate to keep the Japanese economy strong. But the interest rate became negative. And once interest rate became negative, this notion that you would walk in a bank in Japan, borrow 10,000 yen, and you would pay back like 9,000. Then banks refuse to lend. No bank is going to give you money if they know that the interest rates are negative. So since the banks in Japan refused to lend funds, the Japanese economy fell. The whole 10-year time, we call it a Japanese lost decade of the 90s. Japan did not experience economic growth because once banks refused to give loans, businesses in Japan could not access business loans. Consumers could not access consumer loans, so the economy fell. So we also learned the hard way that the zero lower bound on interest rate, when interest rates are near zero, that zero level, can be a very serious problem for the central bank. And then the cost of cleaning up after the financial crisis can be very high. I'm going to show you so shortly. The Federal Reserve spent nearly like about $4 trillion just to bail banks out, to inject liquidity in the banking system. And that is separate from the money that Congress was apportioning to help bail out the economy. Congress was also using tax policy, tax cuts, federal spending to bail the economy from collapse. So the cost of cleaning up can be really high. And then the other thing that we learn is that price and output stability do not ensure financial stability. That is true. In fact, the times that were leading to the financial crisis, the onset of the financial crisis, the US economy was very stable. Prices were very stable. There was no problem with inflation. The economy was doing well. And then all of a sudden, financial crisis just came from nowhere. So we learned that even though the economy could be stable in terms of price level movement and output stability, that does not guarantee you financial stability. Your financial sector can still fall. Banks can still go bankrupt like we saw. Your stock market can still crash. So implication for inflation targeting is that level inflation target needs to be re-emphasized, flexibility inflation targeting. Okay. So the Federal Reserve has a new monetary policy strategy, which is average inflation targeting. In August 2020, the Federal Reserve announced that it will now target an average inflation rate of 2%. Past inflation rates, as a result, would now affect its target in the short run. Okay. Okay. So that's all about inflation targeting. And these are the smaller things that we have discussed. I want to talk about asset price bubble, because this was one of the major issues of, leading to the financial crisis of 2006 or 7 to 2009, the asset price bubble. And I think I talked a little bit about it in the previous chapters, what a bubble is. I'm just going to re-emphasize that again. So what do we mean by a bubble, an asset price bubble? Let's talk about it here. Asset price bubble. A bubble is going to be defined as an explosive increase in the value of an asset, value or price of an asset, which does not truly represent their true fundamental value. Their fundamental value. So it doesn't represent that fundamental value. So the asset, you see the value of an asset exploit. We saw that in the early 2000s with the U.S. housing market. The value of U.S. homes were exploding. If you live in America where you own a house in the early 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, you were having it the whole. You would buy a house for, like, say, $500,000. Before you barely even live in the house, the value would have gone up to $560. The next 2 months, it has gone up to your house is worth $700,000. Just like that. That's what I got. So the bubble is, there are two primary causes of bubble. What economists talked about. So there are two main causes of what an asset price bubble is. Two causes of a bubble, for an asset price bubble. One is what we call credit-driven bubbles. This is the most important one. Credit-driven bubbles. This when banks significantly lend money to an industry. Okay, with perhaps laxity in credit requirements. In other words, the banks make it easier for people to borrow money. Even people who are not supposed to be borrowing money, who might be in poor credit standing, low credit ratings, they'll find themselves accessing credit. And if credit becomes cheap, where it's easy to access credit, what do you think is going to happen in that industry? Let's say you make credit easy for Americans who are looking to buy homes. You make mortgage loans easier to afford or easier to access. Then many Americans who might not even have been thinking about buying a home, they would start buying homes. So the demand for housing is going to rise because people are going to be craving for a house, and that's going to drive the value of the house anyway. So that's what we call credit-driven bubbles. The second bubble cause of a bubble is what we call bubbles that are driven by what we call irrational exuberance. Okay, so bubbles driven by irrational exuberance of the investors. Irrational exuberance. Irrational exuberance is basically when what? When investors in a product or an industry, in a product or an industry, develop while unrealistic expectation about the future value of an asset. For example, in America in the early 2000s, most Americans thought that, oh, if you buy a home, your home was going to double in value within a short time. Then you would flip it and sell it and make a lot more money. So most people had this wild expectation about future increases in the value of housing. And then so they were buying these homes not because they wanted to live in them, but because they just wanted to flip it after a short period of time and make a lot of money out of it. So if all of us think that way, that, oh, this asset, be it a house, be it a stock, is going to be hot, it's going to be like very expensive in the near future, then many people want to buy it now. That's what we call irrational exuberance of the investor. When they develop this wild unrealistic expectation about future increase in the value of an asset, they're going to buy it anyway. By wanting to buy it today, that's going to drive up the demand, and the price and the value of the asset is going to go up anyway. Okay, in empirical models, it's very easy to identify credit-driven model bubbles than to identify bubbles that are what? Driven by rational exuberance. Because this is more like inside the, this is more like an investor psychology. We can, if you're doing this, sometimes what am I trying to say here? It's very difficult to isolate from the data. Let's say somebody tells you that the housing price have gone up 30% within 6 months. So we cannot talk about, the question then is, what is the proportion of that 30% increase which is driven by rational exuberance? The investor psychology. It's very difficult to isolate. Even a bubble itself is very difficult to isolate from the data because a bubble is basically what? What do we say? It's basically this an explosive increase in the value of an asset which does not truly represent their fundamental value. So if an asset goes up in value by 20%, it's very difficult for us economists to isolate what's the proportion of that 30% increase which is truly due to the actual change in the value of the asset, which represents its fundamental value. And what is the part that is due to a bubble? So it's very difficult to separate these two. That's why some economists are arguing that since we cannot even isolate precisely what is causing a bubble, we should not try to even control it, because you don't know what it is in the data. Okay, and then we'll talk about the Greenspan. So that brings the question: should central banks respond to bubbles? How should central banks say? I talk about asset price bubble and pronounced increase in asset price that depart from fundamental values, which eventually bust. So types of credit bubbles, I talk about credit-driven bubbles. Okay, subprime mortgage prices, then bubbles driven by rational exuberance. So the Greenspan doctrine, you can read about the Greenspan doctrine. I'm not going to test you on that. That monetary policy should not be used to prick bubbles. In other words, the Fed should stay away from trying to fix bubbles or maybe create bubbles. So the other thing is, there's what we call macro. Should central bank respond to bubbles? That's a question of our time. The debate whether central banks should respond to bubbles or not continues at the U.S. central bank up to today, even among economists. But there's what we call macroprudential policy. Some economists argue that even though we may not be able to control bubbles directly, but the government should have, the central bank should have some macroprudential policy that they implement at the aggregate macroeconomic level that will affect all the sectors in aggregate. Okay, regulatory policy affect what is happening in credit markets in the aggregate, so that maybe it can have influence of like taming behavior. For example, the Federal Reserve might say, well, we're going to set some lending standards for banks. Banks should have follow certain rules when they lend money. They should not be reckless lending money to an industry, because that's what we saw in 2000, in early 2000, what caused the financial crisis. Monetary policy. So some argues central banks and other regulators should not have a laissez-faire attitude. They where they let the market, free market, go wild. The Fed should actually have some kind of controls. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about in this chapter is going to still is quite a bit. Let's talk about the choosing of the policy target. Okay. So the policy target is more like a tactic. So the tactic is choosing the policy instrument. The policy instrument is not a tool of monetary policy. The tools of monetary policy we talked about over and over again. There are these things, open market operation, you guys know from our previous discussion in other chapters, buying and selling of treasury bonds, the reserve requirement where the Fed sets a required reserve ratio, or with the 10%. The Fed can also determine what? Set the discount rate, which is this interest rate that they charge when banks borrow from a Fed. So, but these are the operating instruments that the Federal Reserve has always targeted. So, as I said, when Paul Volcker became chair of the Fed in 1979, he switched from the Federal Reserve policy from targeting money supply direct to targeting the what? Non-borrow reserves. So non-borrow reserves. So when I talk about reserve agreement, means that they're going to be things like non-borrow reserves. They're going to be things like money supply, like M1, M2, etc. Okay. The policy since 1993, the Federal Reserve under Greenspan switched away from targeting these reserve aggregates to targeting interest rates. So from 1993, we target the federal funds rate. Okay. What you're going to see is that the central bank cannot have more than one operating instrument. It's not possible. Any central bank, be it the Bank of Japan, the Bank of China, the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, you cannot have more than one operating instrument. If you pick one, you let the other one go. I'm going to show you why the Federal Reserve cannot target, like, say, non-borrow reserve, which is a what? One policy instrument, and also target the what? The federal funds rate, the interest rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate that the Fed targets. There's no way the Fed can target both. If the Fed is targeting the non-borrow reserves, that means they want the non-borrow reserves to be at a certain level, that the Fed must give up on the federal funds rate. That means the federal funds rate is going to fluctuate freely. And if the Fed reverses course and says, oh, we're going to target the federal funds rate, then that means the Fed cannot, again, control the non-borrow reserve. The non-borrow reserve is going to fluctuate. Let me show you in a diagram so you see what I'm talking about. So again, I'm saying it is not feasible. It's practically impossible for a central bank to have more than one operating instrument. In other words, the Federal Reserve cannot target the federal funds rate, which is this interest rate that it targets, and also set a target on a non-borrow reserve. No, it's not. If you target one, you let the other one fluctuate. Okay? I'll talk about that shortly. Okay? Before I talk about that, I want to talk about what we call the monetary transmission mechanism. Monetary transmission mechanism. Some textbooks call it propagation mechanism. So monetary transmission mechanism is the idea that if the Federal Reserve changes its policy, like say buy or sell bonds, how does that change in policy end up influencing the real economic activity? How does it transmit itself to affect real GDP, prices, employment in the economy? That's what we call the monetary transmission mechanism. Okay? So I want to talk about it here. These are the tools of monetary policy that we talked about. The Fed can pursue open market operation, discount rate, reserve requirements, interest rate on excess reserves, then large-scale asset purchase, forward guidance. Those are the tools of the Fed. So anytime the Fed, I know some of you are going to say, well, if the Fed is buying bonds, so what? I don't care. It doesn't affect me. Yes, it will. I'm going to show you in a minute here. So let's say, these are the broad goals of monetary policy that we talked about, that the Fed wants to achieve. So the Fed smells something is not going right with the economy. Let's say the Fed wanted what? High employment, but the economy has gone into a recession instead. Let's say the economy goes in a recession. Recession means you're not going to get high unemployment. You're actually going to get high unemployment. So the Federal Reserve is to reduce that unemployment because the goal is maximum employment. So when something goes wrong in the economy here, which doesn't make the Fed meet its goal of policy, the Fed is going to turn it on from here, turn on the policy tools. Now I'm going to show you how if the Fed changes its policy here, how is that going to fix the economy? It's kind of like we all ride bikes. If a chain comes out of your bike, you go to your garage, your toolbox, and you reach for your most favorite tool to fix the chain before you can ride your bike again. Same thing with the Fed. When something goes wrong with the economy, the Fed is going to go to his toolbox, and pick one of these tools to fix that problem. But we want to say, if the Fed picks a hammer to fix the problem, just like you pick like a plier, me, the only tool I know how to use in my house is a plier. If anything, that I need to fix goes beyond a plier, that means beyond my pay grade. I'm going to call somebody who's trained to fix that stuff to come and fix it for me. Okay? So the Fed is going to pick a hammer and it's going to bang that hammer. So we as economists, we want to see how, if the Fed is banging that hammer on something, whether that impact is actually going to be realized here, whether they're going to solve the recessionary problem. That's the way it is. So I want to show you step by step how this happens so that you get to appreciate how policy change, monetary policy change, ends up affecting the real economy. Okay, so we already learned from previous chapters. Okay, so let's say there's a recession like you saw here, and we know that to kill the recession, the Fed needs to buy bonds. So when the Fed buys bonds, what happens? You're very smart. You guys know this because I taught you 3 different ways of how monetary policy should understand. You can understand monetary policy by using the balance sheet. You understand monetary policy using what? The money model, the supply. We talked about the money multiplier. You understand monetary policy using graphs, the market for reserves. Okay, so here's how it works. So let's say the Fed wants to fix the unemployment problem because there's a recession. We know to fix the unemployment problem or to fix a recession, which means higher unemployment. We know that the Fed's most obvious tool or favorite tool, like my plier in my toolbox, is going to be buying bonds, buying securities. And they can purchase these securities either from banks, from private banks, or from the non-bank public. But let's say suppose the Fed buys, and the Fed knows exactly how much they need to be able to solve that problem. Maybe the Fed might say, well, for us to fix that problem, we're going to buy $100 billion worth of securities from banks. And I showed you right in the previous chapter, if the Fed buys $100 billion worth of treasury securities from banks, okay, this is how going to be how the bank balance sheet, the banking system, balance sheet of the banking system is going to change. And this is going to represent how the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is going to change. So the assets, because the Fed is buying securities from banks, that means banks are the ones selling. If you sell something, you lose it. So the banks are going to lose. We have to debit $100 billion of their securities. Meanwhile, the assets of the Fed, because the Fed is the one buying, they will see their securities going up by $100 billion. Okay? Traditionally, when I buy something from you, I need to write you a check. The Fed doesn't need to cut a check to banks because all banks in America have an account with the Fed called the reserve account. Just like me and you, we all have our account with our banks. If you have $10,000 in your checking account and your bank buys something from you, your bank doesn't need to write you a check anymore because you already have an account with your bank. Let's say the bank buys something you worth $200. Your bank is going to just credit your account with your bank, your checking account. You see your checking account going up by $10,200. That's the same story here. Banks have what they call the reserve account. Reserves are bank assets because they're the bank deposit with the Fed. So while reserves are the bank assets, they will show up on the Federal Reserve balance sheet as a liability. That's right. So when the Fed buys something from banks worth $100 billion, the Fed is going to credit the bank's reserve account with the actual amount of purchase. We talked about this. So reserves here is going to go $100 billion. So now you can see that the change in reserves in this case is going to go up, is 100 billion. And the monetary base is going to go by what? Because reserves are part of monetary base. It's also going to increase by what? $100 billion. Okay, so now that's not the end of the story. Now link that to what we talked about. Link that. I want you to link it very clearly to what we talked about. So immediately the Fed buys bonds. The immediate effect of that bond purchase, you already seen it, is going to affect some what we call a policy instrument. Okay, so the policy instruments are going to be what? So we'll talk about. So once you buy bonds, that is going to affect borrow reserves, non-borrow reserves is going to increase. The non-borrow reserve is a policy instrument. Okay, and in chapter 15, I showed you how this you can illustrate this, so you can draw the market for reserves to show what happens. What happened to that policy instrument? The market for reserve, this is, you can call this interest rate. The demand for reserve, remember, is a kink demand curve. It goes like that. And the supply for reserve is a kink supply curve. It's vertical, then it becomes flat. We talked about this in chapter 15. So this flat portion of the supply curve establishes a maximum threshold on interest rate, which we call the discount rate. And then the flat portion of the demand curve here establishes the minimum threshold on interest rate, which we call interest rate on excess reserves, or just call it interest rate on reserves. So equilibrium, where supply curve, this is a non-borrow reserve one, before the Fed bought bonds. So this was the target that the Fed might have had on the federal funds rate, the old target, equilibrium federal funds rate target. So now we know the Fed wants to lower interest rate to keep the economy strong because there's a recession. That's where we're going. There's a recession. The Fed has bought bonds. So now after buying bonds, the immediate thing that's going to be affected, I've shown you with the balance sheet already, reserves are going to go up. But which reserves go up? That's the non-borrow reserves. And you can show it here. When the Fed buys bonds, reserves are going to increase. The non-borrow reserves are going to shift. This thing is going to shift to the what? To the right. Only the vertical portion shift, remember, because the flat portion is another tool of monetary policy. Only the vertical portion of the supply curve is going to shift, not the flat portion. So the new equilibrium is going to be where the new supply curve, which is this black line plus this flat portion, intersect the demand curve, which is this point. So you can see that's going to lead to a decrease in what? Equilibrium federal funds rate target. So if the federal funds rate target was initially 3%, the Fed might have lowered it to what? 2.5 by 50 basis points. And the non-borrow reserves has gone up to NBR2. Okay, so the question is, as I told you, this federal funds rate target, that is not the interest rate that affects the market. How is the market? Because anytime we hear, oh, the Fed has lowered interest rate. When the Fed lowers interest rate, it's not lowering your mortgage rate or your student loan rate. But this is how your student loan rate or your mortgage rate is going to get affected. Because we know. Then you can link this to what we talked about in the previous chapter 14, I believe, and 15. Okay. So we know that there's a relationship between the money supply and the monetary base. You know this equation from chapter 14. The little m is what we call the money what? The money multiplier. Okay, this is your monetary base. Okay, so when the Fed bought bonds here, we say that what? The monetary base increased because non-borrow reserves increase. So monetary base has increased. So that means money supply, monetary base is part of money supply. Money supply is gonna go up. Okay. So then in the money market, that's how your interest rate is going to be affected, because buying bonds led to changes in what? So the money changes in the money supply, which affect now the market interest rate. So you go to the market for money, the money market is going to look like this. So we put interest rate on this axis, nominal interest rate, like interest rate on a mortgage, but we're just averaging it, the average for all market interest rates, which could include mortgage rates, could include lending interest rate out there banks are giving, whatever interest rate you're talking about. Interest rate on a car loan, you know. So if this was the initial level of money supply, which is fixed by the Fed, and this is your money demand function, the money demand function, so this is quantity of money on this axis. So the initial interest rate was this equilibrium I1. So when the Fed increased the money supply by buying bonds, then monetary base of money, that means the money supply curve is going to shift to the right. To M2. See that? So the new equilibrium is where the red thick line intersects the black line. So that's going to lead to lower interest rate. Okay, so now you can see how this thing is transmitting itself. So now I want to summarize something here now so that you get to see this transmission mechanism clearly. So what did we say so far? So the Federal Reserve changed its tool of policy. They bought bonds, buys securities. That's a change in the tool of monetary policy. Then that has transmitted itself to affect the what? The policy instrument. The policy instruments are things like non-borrow reserves. They're things like the federal funds rate. We showed that here. Once the Fed has bought bonds, reserves are going to change. Non-borrow reserves, those are the policy instruments. And once non-borrow reserves changes, the federal funds rate is also a policy instrument. They have all changed. And then once this changes, because since reserves are part of monetary base, that's going to affect monetary base and money supply. So that's going to affect what they call the intermediate targets. So the intermediate targets are things like money supply, like M1, M2, market interest rate, which is this guy here. So that's exactly what we did here. Okay, now it doesn't stop there. It even gets more interest. So now once interest rate, so the Fed has bought bonds, which led to an increase in the non-borrow reserves and a decrease in the federal funds rate, which has led to an increase in money supply and a decrease in the market interest rate. So when market interest rates are now falling, market interest rates now the interest rate on a mortgage, that is going to transmit itself to now affect the what? The real economy. Real economy is going to be what we call those are the policy goals where the Fed wants to be. Because you know that aggregate demand, or GDP, you know the formula for GDP is consumer spending plus investment spending, government spending. You know this equation from your baby economics class. So when the Fed has decreased interest rate, now market interest rate, what do you think is going to happen to investment? Investment is going to go up because interest rates are low. Companies can borrow more money at a lower interest rate. Consumer spending is going to increase. Net export is going to rise with lower interest rate. That means GDP is going to go up. And once GDP goes up, that's how the Fed is going to solve the recessionary problem. Now you see here, see? So you start from here. The Fed is going to buy bonds through open market purchase, and that's going to lead to changes in the policy instruments like non-borrow reserves, federal funds rate. And then once those changes, that led to the what? Changes in intermediate targets. Intermediate targets, things like M1, M2, market interest rate, like what? Like your mortgage rates or your student loan. And then once that is a change, then that's what's going to create more employment because investment goes up, consumption goes up, GDP goes up. then that's how we kill the recession. So we call this the monetary transmission mechanism. And the converse is true. What about if inflation was a problem? Then the Fed would do the exact opposite. Instead of buying bonds, they would sell bonds. So if they sell bonds, that means non-borrowed reserves is going to fall and the federal funds rate would increase. And then the intermediate targets, the money supply would fall, monetary base would fall, okay? Market interest rate will rise. So when market interest rate rises, that means that's the Fed aggregate demand or GDP is going to fall. That's how you reduce inflation. You slow down the economy. Okay. Okay, so remember what I was telling you that a central bank like the Federal Reserve cannot have more than 2 operating instruments. In other words, if the Fed sets a target on one instrument, it's impossible, it's practically impossible to what? To set another target. Okay, I want to look at. So here's what happened during the Greenspan era. No, not Greenspan, during Paul Volcker. We were targeting the non-borrowed reserves. So the Fed has set a target of what? Say it could be trillions of dollars. That's what the level of non-borrowed reserves they want in the system. So if you set a target on non-borrowed reserves, you're not going to be able to control the what? The federal funds rate. You cannot. In other words, you cannot set a target on non-borrowed reserve and set a target on the what? On the federal funds rate. Let me show you what happens. So let's say the Fed had set a target on non-borrowed reserves, NBR star. This is a supply for reserves that determine that NBR. The demand for reserve is in the blue line. And then let's say all of a sudden, banks start to demand reserves, something that the Fed cannot crave because Bank of America start to demand reserves from Citibank. There's increase in demand for reserves by banks. So that will shift the demand curve to the right. So the demand curve is the dashed line shifts to the right. That would potentially raise the federal funds rate from this point to this point. So there's no way the Fed is going to keep this interest rate at IFF star and keep NB. But as long as the target on the non-borrowed reserve stays here, the Fed is going to allow that interest rate go up. Or when banks decrease their demand for reserves, shifting this to the left, equilibrium could fall. As long as this equilibrium means that we still have a target of what? NBR. The Fed doesn't care what would allow the interest rate to fluctuate because they cannot set a target on both non-borrowed reserves and what? On the federal funds rate. And then the second diagram is when the Fed is targeting the what? Like from 1993 under Greenspan, we have been targeting the what? The Fed's funds rate. Let's say the Fed has set a target of 2% on the federal funds rate target, which is at so we're beginning at where the two solid blue lines in a sec, supply for reserve and demand for reserve meet here. Okay, so if the Fed wants the federal funds rate to be at this target of 2%, there's no way the Fed is going to control what? The non-borrowed reserves. Why? Let's say the same reason we talked about. Suppose the demand for reserve increases, shifts to the right. The new equilibrium should have been here, where the new demand curve intersect the supply curve. So that would potentially raise the federal funds rate target to the federal funds rate here. But the Fed wants it at 2%. So what the Fed is going to do, the Fed is going to counter this increase in the demand using what we call a defensive open market purchase. The Fed is going to buy bonds to keep interest rate at its target of 2%. When they buy bonds, the non-borrowed reserve is going to shift to the right. So the new equilibrium is where the new supply curve, which is the dashed line here, and the new demand curve, which is a dashed line, intersect. So that keeps interest rate at its target. But by doing so, the Fed is going to allow the non-borrowed reserves to fluctuate. It won't be able to maintain this non-borrowed reserve, the blue one. No, it'll allow it fluctuates. So that's telling you that the Federal Reserve it's practically impossible to, if you want to fix the interest rate, set a target on federal funds rate, and also set a target on the non-borrowed reserve. You cannot do it. You let the other one fluctuate. The converse is true. If banks were decreasing their demand for reserves, that would potentially decrease interest rate because the demand for reserve would shift from the solid blue line to the dashed line here, dashed red line. So the equilibrium would be where the dashed line intersects the blue line here. So the federal funds rate would potentially decrease, but the Fed doesn't want the federal funds rate to decrease. It wants it to be at its target of 2%. So what does the Fed do to counter that? The Fed is going to pursue what we call a defensive open market sale of treasury securities. If the Fed sells bonds, that's going to decrease the supply of reserves in the banking system. Non-borrowed reserves shifts to the left. Okay? So that keeps interest rate at this target here, but that would allow the non-borrowed reserves to fluctuate. See? So there's no way, it's practically impossible for the Fed to set targets on both federal funds rate and non-borrowed reserves. So here are some of the criteria, because I told you guys about the Federal Reserve has been changing its monetary policy strategy. In 1975, we used to target the money supply directly. And then in 1979, when Paul Volcker became chair of the Federal Reserve, he switched from targeting monetary money supply to targeting the non-borrowed reserves. And that was soon about to change. In 1993, when Alan Greenspan was the chair of the Fed, he changed from targeting what? Non-borrowed reserves to targeting the federal funds rate, which is this interest rate. You hear, oh, the Fed has raised interest rate. So what are the criteria that the Federal Reserve, the central bank is going to use to choose a policy instrument? One of them is what we call observability and measurability. You want a policy instrument which is easier to measure and easier to observe. And interest rate, the federal funds rate, is one of those variables which is easier to measure. We can measure how much its value is changing over time. You also want a policy instrument where the central bank can controllability. So these are, you don't want to target an instrument where the central bank does not have full control. So controllability is going to be one of the criteria for selecting a policy instrument. And then you want a policy instrument where the researchers at the central bank can predict the effect of changes in that instrument on goals, like on GDP growth, on employment, price level movements. We economists, monetary economists, we know how to predict that very well. We know how to predict the impact of, an increase in interest rates, how that is going to eventually affect the GDP, or affect inflation, price level movement, employment. So those are the three criteria. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about for this chapter is the Taylor rule. Okay. So remember, the Federal Reserve, because now the Fed targets the federal funds rate, this is something that the market participants, Wall Street and everyday American, they will watch this every time. Remember, the Fed meets what? The Federal Reserve through its what? Through its agency, through FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, meets 8 times in a year. So in every meeting, in any one of those 8 meetings, the Fed will decide whether to increase, decrease, or decrease the federal funds rate, which is this interest rate they set a target on. Okay, so 8 times that. So the frequency of the Fed meeting is only about every month and a half. But sometimes they may meet more. It depends on if the economy, like in 2007, they were meeting like almost every 2 weeks, because we're in a crisis moment during the financial crisis. Okay, but in normal times, when we're not having a lot of problems, the Fed is going to schedule these meetings 8 times in a year. Now, think about it. Interest rate is something that affects our investment portfolio. If you're investing money, you're on Wall Street, you're investing in stock market or bond market, you want to predict future interest rate, how the interest rate is going to be, and you want to know what the Fed might do to interest rate in their next meeting. So in between meetings, we don't know what the Fed might do to interest rate. So let me tell you guys, if you become very smart at predicting interest rate, what the Fed is going to do, and you're very good at it, that exactly what you predicted is what the Fed actually always does, then you may be a very successful entrepreneur. You can invest money and make a lot of money, because interest rate is tied, changes in interest rates are tied to our investment portfolio. Remember that. But we don't know what the Fed is going to do. We just have to make a prediction. So John Taylor, who is an economics professor at Stanford University, came up with a mathematical rule which he thinks it can be applied for us to use to predict what the Fed might do on the federal funds rate, on the target on interest rate. So you can use this formula to predict what the Fed might do to interest rate in their next meeting. Okay, so here's the foundational principle of the Taylor rule. Okay, so John Taylor believes that, okay, when Congress wrote the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, that created the Federal Reserve in the first place, Congress was concerned about two policy goals that the Fed needs to really have a hammer on them. One of them is price stability, controlling inflation. Then the second one is output stability, making sure that we maximize unemployment. So what we're going to do here, so the belief here is that the goal of the Fed is to make sure that the economy is producing at full employment. So goal that the Congress also wants from the Fed is full employment. Because this is where you maximize employment. When the economy is producing at full employment, it means our production resources are being fully engaged. So when you're at full employment, it means actual output is equal to potential output. So this Y without anything is what we are calling the actual real GDP, output that the economy produces. But this Y with a P, that is what we call potential. Sometimes we call it long run output. Sometimes we call it full employment output. You can use those terms interchangeably to mean the same thing. So we want the actual output in the economy to be equal to full employment. So in this case, the output gap is the difference between actual output and potential output. This is what we're calling the output gap. So if the economy is producing at full employment where actual output equals to full potential output, it means the output gap is zero. So in this case, if the output gap is zero, meaning the economy is producing at full employment, the Federal Reserve should not act on interest rate because the economy is where they want it to be. But the economy is not always going to be at full employment. We always go on a recession. Sometimes we produce beyond full employment. So there are two other possibilities. The second possibility is what about if we're in a recession? Recession means the output gap is negative. It means the actual output, if you subtract full potential output from it, it's going to be less than zero. Recession means the actual output that the economy produces is always less than its full potential value. The economy is producing below its full potential. So the output gap is negative. That's the definition of a recession. So in this case, if there's a recession, we know the Fed must what? The Fed must act. Maybe the Fed is going to lower what? Lower interest rate to keep the economy strong, to grow the economy out of a recession. You know, we talked about that. And then the other possibility is the economy can be overheated. Okay, where you are, that's what we call it inflationary gap. Inflationary gap is when actual output subtract from it full potential output is greater than zero. The output gap is positive. So in inflationary gap, when the economy again is doing too much, like we're overproducing, that means there are dangers of inflation. So if inflation starts rising, then the Fed needs to what? The Fed must what? Must raise interest rate, must increase the federal funds rate. So this is on output. That's goal number one, goal of full employment. So the goal of the Fed is always going to be here. So if output falls below full employment, the Fed is going to what? Act by lowering interest rate. If output rises above full employment level or potential level, the Fed is going to raise interest rates. That is a goal on what? On output stability or a maximum employment. What about inflation? Because those are the two values. So what about the goal of inflation? Let's talk about it. So remember, the goal of the Federal Reserve is not to make inflation zero. That's the goal. That's not the goal of any central bank. The Fed still want inflation to grow, but modest. So we normally say that the target for the Federal Reserve is about 2% inflation. Because if prices don't change at all in the economy, that's also bad. It's a disincentive to investment. Okay, so on inflation, which is goal 2, price stability. we believe that the Fed is going to set a target. Pi t is going to be the target inflation. The Fed might want, we economists believe that this is about 2%. And then we're going to define pi without a t as the actual inflation. So the inflation gap, we're going to have what we call the inflation gap, just like we talk about GDP gap. There's going to be two scenarios. Case one, if actual inflation minus target inflation equals to 0, that means the Fed should not change interest rate. If the policy was on interest rate alone, they should not change interest rate because inflation happens to be where the Fed wants it to be. But if actual inflation pi rises above the target, something like that, that means inflation becomes a problem like we've seen in recent times. It rises above the target inflation by the Fed. The Fed is going to what? The Fed must raise interest rates, the federal funds rate. And then 3, if actual inflation minus target inflation is below 0, meaning that actual inflation falls below the Fed's target of 2%, then the Fed must what? The Fed must lower interest rate to bring inflation back to its target. Okay, so now John Taylor is going to come up with this formula, which he believes we should be smart enough to use it to predict what the Fed might do on interest rate. Because if you do it, you might know how to structure your investment well. Okay, so they are going to be given values. So for example, so this what we're going to be calling equilibrium federal funds rate, real federal funds rate. This is predicted by economists. The numbers are known. Equilibrium real federal funds rate, which we're going to be denoting as what? IFFR. This is always going to be given you in the problem. This is given to you. Okay, so the formula, the Taylor rule formula that John Taylor is setting says that, I'm going to write it in full, then I write it in short form, is that the target federal funds rate must equal to what? So so let's say the Fed is about to meet in a month, and so Taylor is arguing that you can use this formula to figure out what the target on federal funds rate is going to be when the Fed meets in a month. So you start structuring, you know what assets to buy right now, this kind of stuff. Okay, so this is going to be equals to it's going to be equals to actual inflation, or you can call it current inflation, plus you're going to add to it equilibrium real federal funds rate. And then we're going to add to it 1/2 times what we're going to be called the inflation target. Then we're going to add 1/2 multiplied it by the output gap. So according to Taylor, the Fed is going to set equal weights on inflation gap, inflation gap here, not target, inflation gap, and the output gap. So in short form, I'm going to, my notation here for federal funds rate is just going to be written as IFFT. That's a target that the Fed is going to set when they meet, must equal to the actual inflation is what I'm calling pi, plus equilibrium federal funds rate target. This equilibrium federal funds rate is going to be real for the, right? This is given to you, plus 1/2 times the inflation target. Our inflation target is written as pi minus pi t, sorry, inflation gap, plus the output gap, which is 1/2 times y minus y bar, y, or you can say yp, y. This is the Taylor rule formula, which is you're saying here. Federal funds rate target must equal to actual inflation rate plus equilibrium real federal funds rate plus 1/2 times inflation gap times the output gap. So we can do an example. Let's see, I have a little bit of time. Let's do an example or two in the actual implementation of this. I'm going to do an example with the Taylor rule. And I've written a couple of examples in your last homework assignment at Canvas. So make sure now when you're finishing that assignment, you should know you know what to do. Let's do a few examples on the Taylor rule. So let's do example 1. We can say, suppose actual inflation is equal to the Fed's target inflation of 2%. And then I say, and GDP is at full employment. Then I say, if the equilibrium, so this number is, so this guy is always going to be given to you. If the equilibrium real interest rate, real federal funds rate is 2% too, it's 2%. Okay. Calculate the target. So the target federal funds rate using the Taylor rule. Okay, so we summarize our work here. So the question says actual inflation. We know actual inflation is pi, is equal to the Fed's target. Target equals this pi t, and that's set at 2%. So what does that mean? This implies that the inflation gap is 0. Actual inflation minus target inflation is going to be 0. And then we have also been told that the economy is at full employment, GDP is at full employment, meaning that what? Y equals to YP. P here. So that means the output gap is also going to be 0. And then we have been given that equilibrium federal funds rate, real federal funds rate is 2%. Okay, so we can use the formula for the Taylor rule to figure out what you can use that, because we already know the actual inflation and GDP today. So we are trying to predict what the Fed might do to interest rate when they meet next time. So the formula says that the target on the federal funds rate, you take actual inflation pi, you add to it the equilibrium federal funds rate, real federal funds rate, then you add to it 1/2 times the inflation gap, which is pi minus pi to the t, plus 1/2 times the output gap, which is y minus yp. So here is going to be what? Actual inflation is 2%. And then we have also been given this to be 2%. Plus, we know actual inflation equals to target inflation, so this is 0. We found that here. Plus 1/2. The output is at full employment, so this is 0 too. So this is 0, this is 0. 1/2 times 0 is 0. So that, according to Taylor, the Fed is going to set its target on interest rate at 4%. So according to the Taylor rule, when economies are full employment and the inflation is at where the Fed wants to be at its target of 2%, the federal funds rate that the Fed is going to set when they meet should be around 4%. Let's do another example. Okay, so this the second example, we're going to assume that one. Say example 2. So suppose actual inflation rises 1 percentage point, 1 percentage point above the Fed's targeting above the Fed's target inflation of 2%. And GDP is at full employment. Okay, so we're going to say if the equilibrium real federal funds rate is 2%, use the Taylor rule to calculate the target federal funds rate. Okay, so the solution here is very straightforward. We already know this. So they're saying that suppose actual inflation rises 1 percentage point above the Fed's target of 2%. What does that mean? That means your actual inflation is 3%, because 3% is 1 percentage point above the what? The target of 2%. So what that means. Okay. And then output is at full employment. That means actual output and potential output is going to be 0. Equilibrium federal funds rate, real federal funds rate is 2%. So we use a formula. So that means, according to the Taylor rule, the target federal funds rate should be equals to, you take what? Actual inflation plus the equilibrium real federal funds rate target, the IFFR, which is given, plus 1/2 times the inflation gap, which is pi minus pi t, plus the output gap, which is what? Y minus YP. So according to the Taylor rule, the target on the federal funds rate should be, remember, this is 3%. Actual inflation. This is 2%. It's given in the problem. Plus, this is going to be 1/2. Pi is what? 3 minus pi t is what? 2. Then plus, this is 0 because output is at full employment. Okay, so that means according to Taylor, the federal funds rate target should be set at 5.5%, 5.5%. 5.5 is written as 5.5. So this is 3 plus 2 is 5. 3 minus 2 is 1. So 1/2 times 1 is 1/2. 1/2 plus 5 is 5.5. So according to Taylor, if you begin from a point where GDP was stable at full employment and what? Inflation was at where the Fed wants it to be at the 2% target. And then inflation rises above the target by 1 percentage point. The Fed should raise interest rate from 4% to 5.5% in their next meeting. That's an increase of 150 basis points. 1 by 1, they should raise interest rate by 1.5% or 150 basis points from 4% to 5.5%. Okay. What about one more example? Okay, one last example on the Taylor rule. So example 3. We're going to say, suppose real GDP falls 1 percentage point below its full employment value. Okay. Assume that inflation is back at its target. It's back at its target value of 2% and equilibrium real federal funds rate is also 2%. Then you can say, use the Taylor rule to predict what the target federal funds rate will be. When the Fed meets, what's going to be their target? So you summarize. So we've been told here that the first thing we've been told is that what? Inflation, actual inflation is back to its target range of what? 2%. So this means the inflation gap is 0. Pi minus pi t is 0. And then we have been told that real GDP or actual output falls 1 percentage point below its full employment value. So that means 1 percentage point below, it means the output gap is negative. Well, if I say if output, real GDP rises 1 percentage point above full employment, it means the output gap is positive. But since it falls below its full employment value, it means the gap between actual output and full employment is going to be negative 1%. If the question had been phrased, output rose 1 percentage point above its full employment value, this would be a positive 1%. And then, of course, equilibrium federal funds rate, real federal funds rate is still giving us 2%. So according to Taylor, we need to find how we can set this federal funds rate. So IFFT is given by, you take inflation plus equilibrium real federal funds rate plus 1/2 times the inflation gap, written as that, plus 1/2 times the output gap. Okay, so according to Taylor, the target federal funds rate should be, this is, remember, is 2%. This is also 2%. The inflation gap is going to be 0 in this case. This is 0. But then the gap here is negative 1%. There you go. So according to Taylor, the federal funds rate target should be set at 2 plus 2, that's 4%. This is 0. 1/2 times negative 1, that's negative 1/2. So negative 1/2 plus 4%, that's going to be, this is going to be equals to what? That's right here. So that means IFFT is going to be 3.5%. So what have we learned? So according to Taylor, if output falls 1 percentage point below target, meaning that maybe we're in a recession, the Fed should lower interest rate from 4% to 3.5%. But if inflation rises 1 percentage point above the target range of the Fed of 2%, then the Fed should increase the federal funds rate target by 1.5% or 150 basis points, from 4% to 5.5%. So even though the Fed assigns equal weight on inflation and output gap, it looks like the policy of the Fed is more sensitive to inflation than it is to output gap. Because you have seen it, when inflation rises just 1 percentage point above target, the Fed will raise interest rate by 1.5%. But when output falls by 1 percentage point below target, the Fed only cuts interest rate by 0.5%. So the Fed will move aggressively to solve the inflationary problem than they do to solve the unemployment problem due to a recession when output is falling below target. So I talked about that already. You know those. So NAIRO is basically, NAIRO stands for Natural Accelerated Inflation Rate of Unemployment. This guy stands for Natural Accelerating, this is a new term, inflation rate of unemployment. That's what it stands for. It's basically the rate of unemployment at which there's no tendency for inflation to change. Sometimes when you have unemployment that there's going to be no tendency for inflation to change, that we call that we've achieved NAIRO. But anyway, if you look at the federal funds rate predicted by the Taylor rule, and the actual federal funds rate, which end up occurring, the Taylor rule actually predicts that very well. So because since the 1960s to more recent times, see, the blue line is the federal funds rate target that the Fed sets. The red line is what we've been predicting using this formula. So the Taylor rule, that mathematical formula that Stanford University professor John Taylor came up with, is actually that's a very good predictive power, how you can predict what the Federal Reserve might do to interest rate when they meet. So anyway, this is going to be my last word for this class. So make sure you watch all the video. I'm going to process all these videos and watch it. The exam is going to be on Friday. I've read everything you need to know is at Canvas. And it was a pleasure to having you as my students, and you have a nice rest of your semester, summer semester, and I'll see some of you are going to appear in my other upper division classes, like intermediate macro or maybe in the graduate macroeconomic classes. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye-bye.